The silver platters on the long banquet table caught the reflection of the heavy crystal chandeliers above, casting sharp, cold fragments of light across the crowded room. The air smelled of expensive white truffles, roasted rosemary, and the rich, sweet scent of aged red wine. Music played softly from hidden speakers, a gentle piano melody that felt entirely out of place compared to the absolute freezing coldness spreading through my chest. I am Clara, a 31-year-old single mother, and I was standing near the edge of the velvet curtains, wearing a faded gray dress that I had sewn myself. My hands were pressed tightly against my sides to keep them from trembling. A few feet away from me, my younger sister, Vanessa, stood in the center of a circle of wealthy corporate executives. She was wearing a tailored emerald silk gown that shimmered every time she moved, and on her left hand, a flawless diamond ring caught the light. She looked radiant, powerful, and completely untouchable as the newly appointed Senior Vice President of Sinclair Enterprises. She turned her head, her sharp green eyes locking onto mine, and a slow, cruel smile crept across her perfectly painted lips. She walked over to me, her high heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. She leaned in close, the scent of her expensive French perfume filling my senses, and whispered into my ear, "You were always just a stepping stone for this family, Clara. We used your little boyfriend to secure the multi-million-dollar merger, and we used your life to build my seat at this table. Get used to the dirt, because that is where you belong." She pulled back, laughing softly as our parents joined her, their faces filled with absolute pride for their golden child. They did not look at me. They did not acknowledge the sister who had been stripped of everything. But as I stood there in the shadows of their grand celebration, my hand brushed against the crisp edge of a white paper document hidden inside my pocket. They believed they had successfully traded my heart for a corporate empire, but they had no idea that the quietest person in the room was about to dismantle their entire world. As I stood in that crowded hall, watching my own family celebrate my ruin, the world seemed to slow down completely. I know many of you are watching this right now from different places around the world. What is the weather like outside your window today? And where are you joining me from? Is it a bright morning, a quiet afternoon, or late at night? Have you ever experienced a moment where the people who gave you life treated you like an absolute stranger? This story is deeply personal, and I know it will travel very far across the internet to reach the people who need to hear it most. But before I tell you what happened next, let me take you back to how this started. The story truly begins in the coastal town of Oak Ridge, where my parents owned a grand historical estate surrounded by perfectly manicured green lawns and towering oak trees. Inside the house, everything was designed to project an image of absolute perfection, wealth, and high social status. The floors were polished mahogany, the walls were lined with expensive oil paintings, and a massive grandfather clock ticked heavily in the main hallway, counting down the hours of a life built on an elaborate lie. My father, Richard, was a highly respected structural engineer who commanded absolute authority in the community, while my mother, Eleanor, spent her days organizing high society charity galas. To the outside world, we were the perfect American family, but behind those heavy oak doors, the power dynamic was brutal and clear. My younger sister, Vanessa, was the undisputed golden child. She was beautiful, manipulative, and deeply aware of her power over our parents. I, on the other hand, was the quiet observer, the daughter who was expected to sacrifice her own desires to maintain the family glory. For years, I tolerated their emotional abuse and their extreme favoritism. When I was 19, Vanessa accidentally crashed my father's luxury sedan into a stone wall while driving without a license. Richard had forced me to tell the insurance company and the local police that I was the one behind the wheel, claiming that a blemish on Vanessa's record would destroy her chances at an Ivy League education. I spent a year on probation, while Vanessa went off to a prestigious university with a brand new convertible. 2 years later, when our elderly grandmother fell deeply ill, my mother wept into her silk handkerchief, claiming her nerves could not handle the stress of caregiving, while my father intimidated me into turning down my own college scholarship to stay home as a full-time, unpaid nurse. I spent 3 long years lifting my grandmother, changing her linens, and listening to her quiet wisdom, while Vanessa traveled Europe during her summer breaks. Our parents maintained an environment of absolute control. Whenever Vanessa demanded something, Eleanor would cry silently until I gave in, and Richard would slam his heavy hand on the dinner table, stating that family loyalty meant supporting the sister who was destined for true greatness. During those long, isolating years of caregiving, the only outsider who ever entered our home was a quiet senior compliance auditor named Arthur Pendleton. He was a distant colleague of my father who occasionally came to the estate to review old structural contracts and corporate ledgers. Arthur was an elderly man with calm gray eyes and a faded tweed jacket. He never spoke much during the family dinners, but he always observed the way my parents spoke to me and the way Vanessa would casually take credit for the household organization. He would offer me a small, polite nod of respect before disappearing into the study with his leather briefcase. Everything began to break 3 years ago when I met Julian. He was a brilliant young architect who came to work on a municipal project with my father. Julian did not care about the family status or the grand estate. He saw me for who I truly was. For the first time in my life, I felt loved, valued, and completely safe. We spent 2 beautiful years building a quiet life together, and he eventually became the father figure to my young son, Leo. We were planning our wedding, and Julian had just promised to help me break free from my family's shadow forever. But my parents and Vanessa saw Julian's wealthy family background and his corporate connections as the ultimate prize for their own fading firm. They needed a massive merger with Sinclair Enterprises to save themselves from a hidden financial crisis, and Vanessa decided that Julian was the exact currency they needed to buy their way into the corporate elite. The systematic destruction of my life did not happen overnight. It was a calculated, cruel progression that began exactly 14 months ago in the privacy of my father's home office. The first level of escalation occurred on a rainy Tuesday morning. My father called me into his study, the room smelling heavily of cigar smoke and old paper. He sat behind his massive desk and looked at me with cold contempt. "Clara, you need to understand your place," he said, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "Julian is far too ambitious to be held back by a single mother with no professional standing. Vanessa is the one who can elevate his career, and you are actively dragging him down into the mud." I stood there, keeping my breathing regular, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. The second level happened a week later in the upstairs hallway. Vanessa blocked my path while holding a box of her old, stained designer clothes. She dumped them on the floor at my feet with a sharp laugh. "You should take these, Clara," she sneered. "Maybe if you look a little less pathetic, Julian won't look so embarrassed when he introduces you to his high society colleagues." I simply looked at the clothes, stepped over them, and walked down the stairs without saying a single word. The third level moved from private humiliation to public manipulation. My parents organized a large charity gala at the local country club, inviting Julian's entire family and his corporate superiors. During the main dinner, while I was sitting at the back table, Vanessa stood at the microphone and publicly thanked the staff, specifically naming me as the temporary family clerk who handled the basic cleaning and filing because I lacked the capacity for higher corporate roles. The entire room looked at me with pity, and I saw Julian's father frown deeply. I remained seated, my spine perfectly straight, watching the stage. The fourth level was a direct assault on my relationship. My father and Vanessa arranged a private meeting with Julian's father, presenting him with completely falsified financial documents and a fabricated background check. They claimed that I had embezzled thousands of dollars from my grandmother's estate during her final years, and that I was using Julian purely for financial gain. They offered Vanessa as the stable, brilliant alternative who could secure a multi-million-dollar partnership between the two family firms. Julian was given an ultimatum by his father: marry Vanessa and secure his inheritance, or stay with me and be entirely cut off from the architectural industry. The fifth crossed a deeply personal and illegal line. I had spent the past 2 years developing a comprehensive regional marketing and structural design campaign for an independent grant. The grant was worth exactly $420,000 in federal funding, which would have given me complete financial independence and a permanent career. One afternoon, I discovered that my original design files had been wiped from my computer. 3 days later, Vanessa publicly announced that she had won the $420,000 grant under her own name, using my exact layouts, descriptions, and structural formulas. My father had used his administrative master keys to download my work and transfer the legal ownership to his golden child. The final, crushing level of the ladder occurred in our family kitchen on the evening of Vanessa's formal corporate betrothal to Julian. Julian had completely broken under the intense pressure of his family and the fabricated lies about my character. He stood in the corner, refusing to meet my eyes, looking entirely hollow. Vanessa walked up to me holding a glass of champagne, while our mother and father stood behind her like guards. She leaned in, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of greed and triumph, and spoke the sentence that exposed her true character to the core. "We traded your little boyfriend for a multi-million-dollar corporate partnership, Clara, and Dad signed the papers yesterday to ensure your name is erased from every single contract in this city. You are nothing but a ghost in this house, and ghosts do not get to keep the prizes." The room went entirely cold. My mother looked down at her polished shoes, remaining completely silent. My father took a step forward, his jaw clenched in an aggressive attempt to intimidate me into submission. "No." That was the only word I said. I turned around. I walked away. The door closed. I went back to the tiny, cramped apartment that I rented on the edge of the industrial district. The walls were thin, and the sound of the passing trains rattled the old glass windows every 20 minutes. I sat on the edge of my bed, my mind racing, the sheer weight of their betrayal pressing down on my chest like a physical block of concrete. I felt completely hollow, wondering how a person could survive when their own flesh and blood had systematically stripped them of their love, their career, and their dignity. Then, the door to the small bedroom creaked open. My 7-year-old son, Leo, walked out, holding his old, tattered teddy bear. He had big, innocent brown eyes, and he looked at my pale face and my red, tired eyes with deep concern. He came over, sat down on the floor next to my knees, and pulled gently on my hand. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly in the quiet room. "Why does Aunt Vanessa get to take your smiles away? And why are we always the ones who have to live in the dark?" His innocent question was like a sudden, blinding flash of lightning in a midnight storm. The fog in my mind cleared instantly. I looked at his small, sweet face, and I realized that by tolerating their abuse, I was teaching my son that it was acceptable to be crushed by cruel people. I had spent 3 years protecting Vanessa and keeping the peace for the sake of my parents' public reputation. In that moment, I stopped. The quiet, enduring girl who accepted the scraps from her family's table died right there on that old mattress. A mother with absolutely nothing left to lose, and a woman who possessed the cold, hard truth took her place. I rubbed my son's hair, gave him a small smile, and told him to go back to sleep. The time for crying was officially over, and the time for absolute, calculated justice had begun. The next morning, at exactly 10:14 a.m., I did not scream and I did not send angry text messages to my family. Instead, I walked into the grand public library downtown, sat at a corner computer terminal, and opened a secure, encrypted email line. I sent a single, precisely worded message to Arthur Pendleton, the quiet, senior compliance auditor who had observed our family for so many years. I attached a small digital file that my grandmother had given me on her deathbed, a private logbook containing the true corporate account numbers of my father's firm. Arthur responded within exactly 12 minutes. His message was short and professional. "Meet me at the coffee shop behind the Federal Building in 1 hour, Clara. Bring the physical documents." When I arrived, Arthur was sitting in a dark leather booth, a massive pile of financial ledgers and corporate records spread before him. For the past 3 years, he had been quietly conducting a private investigation into my father's structural engineering firm under a federal compliance mandate. He looked up at me with absolute seriousness. "Clara, your grandmother knew exactly what your father and sister were doing," Arthur explained, handing me a certified forensic accounting report. 3 years ago, when your father forced you to stay home, he didn't just steal your time. He and Vanessa used your identity to create a shell company. They embezzled exactly $650,000 from the grandmother's trust fund, and they used your forged signature on 3 separate federal contract applications to conceal their illegal transactions. The hidden truth began to surface with terrifying clarity. Vanessa's entire corporate rise, her master's degree funding, and the multi-million-dollar merger with Sinclair Enterprises were built on a foundation of deliberate identity theft and financial fraud against me. They had used my name as a shield so that if the federal auditors ever discovered the missing funds, the criminal liability would fall entirely on my shoulders. The $420,000 grant that Vanessa had just stolen from me was the final piece of their puzzle, intended to pay back the initial embezzled funds before the official corporate audit cycle ended in exactly 14 days. Arthur looked at me, his gray eyes turning to ice. "I have the complete forensic trail, Clara. I have the IP addresses from your father's office computer where your signature was digitally forged, and I have the original bank records proving the $650,000 was moved directly into Vanessa's private offshore account. But to initiate the federal clawback and criminal charges, I need your formal signed affidavit as the primary victim." I took the black pen from Arthur's hand. I signed my name on the legal documents. The affidavit was stamped and filed with the Federal Regulatory Commission at exactly 2:45 p.m. The following afternoon, Vanessa called my phone. Her voice was frantic, high-pitched, and filled with a dangerous undercurrent of panic. She had just received an automated notification from the federal compliance system stating that her $420,000 grant funding had been frozen due to an ongoing identity theft investigation. "You pathetic little parasite," Vanessa screamed through the line, her refined corporate persona completely vanishing. "What did you do? If you ruin this merger for me, I will ensure the landlord evicts you and your bastard son from that disgusting apartment by tomorrow morning. Dad will make sure you never find a job in this state again." I held the phone a few inches away from my ear, listening to her breathe heavily through the speaker. My voice remained completely flat, completely calm, and entirely devoid of fear. The auditors are already sitting in your corporate office, Vanessa, and the paper trail leads directly to your front door. You are nothing, she spat back, her voice shaking with pure rage. No one will ever believe a struggling single mother over a senior vice president. We own the contracts, and we own your future. I pressed the small red button on my screen. I hung up.
The annual Sinclair Enterprises shareholder gala was held at the Grand Plaza Hotel. It was a black tie event designed to celebrate the finalization of the multi-million-dollar merger and Vanessa's official appointment as senior vice president. The room was a spectacular display of wealth, filled with over 200 high-profile investors, city officials, and journalists. The crystal chandeliers gleamed brightly, reflecting off the diamond necklaces and the polished silver serving trays. Vanessa stood on the elevated main stage, standing behind a polished mahogany podium. Our parents, Richard and Eleanor, sat at the front VIP table, their faces glowing with absolute social triumph. Julian stood beside them, looking like a well-dressed prop in a corporate play. Vanessa smiled warmly into the microphones, performing her role of the brilliant, innocent young executive perfectly. "We are on the precipice of a new era of corporate excellence," she announced, her voice echoing through the massive hall. "This merger represents years of hard work, dedication, and uncompromised integrity." I walked through the double doors at the back of the hall. I was accompanied by Arthur Pendleton and 3 sharply dressed investigators from the Federal Regulatory Compliance Division. We walked down the center aisle, the quiet rustle of our footsteps causing the nearest shareholders to turn around in confusion. Vanessa stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes widened as she saw me approaching the stage. My father stood up from his table, his face turning a dark, dangerous crimson as he tried to step into the aisle to block my path. "Clara, get out of here right now," Richard whispered aggressively, his fists clenching at his sides. "I will have the security guards throw you into the street." The federal investigators stepped past him, displaying their gold shields directly in his face. "Mr. Miller, stay seated," one of the officers said, his voice carrying an absolute weight of authority that made my father freeze in his tracks. Arthur Pendleton walked directly to the technical control booth at the side of the stage. With a single click of his flash drive, the massive digital projector screen behind Vanessa changed from the Sinclair corporate logo to a series of high-definition documents. The entire room went completely silent as the screen displayed the original bank ledgers showing the fraudulent transfer of $650,000, followed by the explicit IP address tracking certificates, proving that Richard and Vanessa had forged my signature from their home office. The next slide showed the forensic evidence of the stolen $420,000 grant, accompanied by my signed federal affidavit. The shareholders began to murmur loudly, their faces filled with shock and disgust. Journalists immediately began snapping photos, the bright flashes illuminating Vanessa's pale, terrified face as she stood trapped behind the podium. My mother, Eleanor, began to weep loudly into her hands, but for the first time in her life, her tears did not change the room. Julian's father stood up from the VIP table, looked at the screen, and then looked at my father with utter contempt. "The merger is dead," he said clearly, before turning to his son. "Julian, we are leaving." Julian followed him without looking back at Vanessa even once. Vanessa looked down at me from the stage, her corporate mask completely shattering into a terrifying display of desperate rage. "You did this to me!" she screamed into the open microphone, her voice echoing horribly through the loudspeakers. "You are just a jealous, uneducated clerk. I took what was necessary to save this company, and you are nothing but trash." Her own words, spoken publicly into the record in front of 200 witnesses and federal investigators, sealed her fate completely. The lead investigator stepped onto the stage, producing a formal warrant. Vanessa Miller and Richard Miller, you are under arrest for federal financial fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement, the officer stated clearly. They were led out of the grand ballroom in handcuffs, their arms pinned behind their backs, their expensive clothes wrinkling as they were escorted past the silent, staring crowd. My father was shouting obscenities, while Vanessa stared at the floor, her hair falling wildly out of her perfect bun. I stood near the exit, my arms crossed, watching them pass. I did not smile, I did not shout, I did not celebrate. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom closed behind them, cutting off the sound of their panic and ending their world forever.
The legal fallout from that evening was swift, devastating, and absolute. The multi-million-dollar merger with Sinclair Enterprises collapsed entirely within 48 hours, forcing my father's engineering firm into immediate involuntary bankruptcy. Following a comprehensive federal trial that lasted 7 months, Vanessa was sentenced to exactly 24 months in a federal correctional facility for identity theft and financial fraud. She was also ordered to pay a restitution penalty of $420,000 directly back to my independent corporate account. My father, Richard, was stripped of his engineering license, convicted of corporate embezzlement, and ordered to pay a civil fine of $150,000. To cover the legal debts and fines, my parents were forced to sell the grand historical estate at a massive loss. My mother, Eleanor, now lives in a tiny rented one-bedroom apartment in a distant town, completely isolated from the high society community that once revered her. With the return of my original marketing grant and the restitution funds, I built a completely independent life. I purchased a small, beautiful home with a large backyard on the quiet side of the city. The rooms are bright, filled with sunlight, fresh flowers, and the sound of laughter. I opened my own independent structural design consultancy, which currently employs 3 full-time assistants. My favorite moment of every day happens at 6:30 a.m. I sit at my small wooden kitchen table, holding a warm cup of coffee, looking out the window into the yard. I watch my son, Leo, running across the green grass with our new golden retriever, his loud, joyful laughter echoing through the morning air. I slept through the entire night for the first time in 10 years, without a single fear, without a single shadow hanging over my head. 3 weeks ago, I received a handwritten letter from Vanessa from the correctional facility. It was filled with long, desperate apologies, claiming she had been manipulated by our father and begging me to visit her to help secure an early parole hearing. I did not respond. I folded the paper, placed it inside the recycling bin, and went back to preparing my son's school lunch. This long, painful journey taught me a vital lesson about the true nature of family and survival. I learned that love is not defined by blood, and loyalty should never be confused with the systematic self-destruction of your own soul. True boundaries are not built out of anger or revenge. They are built out of a quiet, unshakable respect for your own life and the future of the children who look to you for strength. So, if you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have signed the federal affidavit and exposed the truth to protect your child? Or would you have chosen the easier, wrong choice by remaining silent to keep the family peace?